Good afternoon. I'm Susie Gelman. I'm privileged to serve as chair of Israel Policy Forum. We're an organization that was created in 1993 at the behest of then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was seeking an American Jewish organizational partner to help him with his pursuit of peace through the Oslo Accords. We're doing today's webinar in proud partnership with the JCPA. Israel Policy Forum's mission is to build support among policymakers in Washington and lay and professional leaders in the Jewish community for pragmatic efforts to advance the goal of a two-state solution as the only way to preserve Israel's future as a secure, Jewish, and democratic state. We at Israel Policy Forum offer a variety of opportunities and resources such as conference calls and briefings, or online analysis and interactive tools, and programs in partnership with organizations like JCPA to discuss policy reports that are hot off the presses. We believe that in order to legitimately discuss two states, we need to be forthright about the challenges that Israel faces, particularly regarding security. For too long, observers have neglected to address the Gaza issue, focusing only on the West Bank. We realize that needs to change in order to be effective and informed advocates for two states. That's why I served on the Center for New American Security Brookings Task Force on Gaza last year, along with our Executive Director, David Halperin, and our Policy Director, Michael Koplow. The task force's efforts led to the publication of this significant report last December. So now I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers who will present the report's findings and analysis, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Hadi Amar is currently a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. Most recently, Hadi served at the State Department from 2013 to 2017 as part of Secretary Kerry's peace team, including as Deputy Special Envoy focusing on economics and Gaza. Ilan Goldenberg is a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for New American Security and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. Ilan served as the chief of staff to Special Envoy Martin Indyk during the last round of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. And then Natan Sachs, our third panelist, is the director of the Brookings Institution Center for Middle East Policy. His research focuses on Israel's foreign policy, its domestic politics, and on U.S.-Israel relations. So as mentioned before, we will be taking questions from the audience after the presentation. Please type your question in the question box, and our speakers will try to answer as many as possible in the time we have remaining. Now it's my pleasure to hand it off to Ilan, Hadi, and Natan. And once more, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Susie, and thank you everyone for joining us. This is Ilan Goldenberg with CNAS, and I'm going to talk for a couple minutes basically about the project and what we did, and then hand it over to Hadi and Natan to get deeper into the policy recommendations. So look, the bottom line is that, Hadi and I, we both worked on the peace team during the last round of negotiations. Natan has been dealing with this issue for years. And all of us have found the same thing. The basic approach is definitely the basic American approach for years has been, since Hamas took over Gaza in 2007, has been, we're going to focus on the West Bank. We're going to find a way to make peace between Israel and the PLO, between Israelis and Palestinians. And once this issue is solved, Hamas will have no choice but to join that peace, give up on Gaza, and everything will be. That's been the basic assumption. Kind of a rosy assumption that actually doesn't make a lot of sense, and one that's obviously not come to pass. And so what we thought was actually do a deep study on Gaza, because this is a separate issue that is ongoing and has been going for a long time. And if it's not addressed separately, we're just going to continue with this assumption and ignoring the problem. And so we started looking at the question of Gaza. And what we found is basically that we've had a violence that's existed since 2007 when Hamas took over Gaza. It goes something like this. Hamas uses violence to put pressure on Israel to try to achieve its objectives. Israel responds with a closure of Gaza, essentially a blockade, which is supported by Egypt and the rest of the international community. Pressure builds inside Gaza until Hamas releases that pressure by increasing violence until we end up in a conflict. And once we have a major conflict, everybody jumps in, the US, Egypt, the UN, the international community to stop it. They negotiate something, and once it's been negotiated, they all agree they're going to work on all kinds of other things to address the long-term problems. None of those things actually happen. And you just end up in this cycle again and again and again, where violence starts to increase, economic pressure, boom. And so what we did to try to address this was bring together this task force, which includes, I think, 3 or 4 different former US ambassadors to Israel, former consul generals to the Palestinians, a number of former senior American officials. Really, I would argue almost all of the key Israel-Palestine experts based in Washington who cover these issues, or nearly all of them, a huge group, address this question of Gaza. And fundamentally, we found 3 things. One, there's a huge humanitarian disaster currently ongoing in Gaza, and whatever we do about the politics, we need to focus immediately on alleviating some of these very clear economic and humanitarian concerns. 2, the U.S. has a role to play, much more than it's played so far in ignoring the problem. But the U.S. has to play a leadership role. It doesn't have to do it on its own, and that's not what we argue, bump everybody else out, but the U.S. needs to work together with Egypt and the UN and over time, bring the entire international community into alignment on this question. And 3, we need to look for a political solution in the long run. It's not possible today, but in the long run, that basically tries to come to some kind of agreement between Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas on a long-term arrangement that ends this perpetual conflict. And we think that that is possible and really the only viable alternative. So those are the basic findings of the report. And what I'll do is turn it over to Hattie and then Natan to really dive deep on both the economic and humanitarian questions, and then the political questions and recommendations that we make. So Hattie, turn it over to you first.
Thanks, Ilan. Hopefully folks can hear me, and that was a great introduction. And I really want to stress this task force was an extraordinary group of folks that came together, really the sort of majority of Israel, Palestine, Middle East experts that have served in administrations over the last years. Look, what I want to get into here over just a few minutes is really painting a picture of the humanitarian catastrophe that continues to unfold in Gaza, describe how the system is fundamentally broken, but then talk about some ways to fix it. And so that's what I'll do here over just the next 3 or 4 minutes, hopefully, maybe 5. So look, but before I say that, I just want to remind everybody where we are in the Middle East, which is that Israel has succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of its founders. Its per capita GDP is now one of the highest in the world. It's wealthier per capita than Italy, France, even the UK and Japan. Its economy is bigger than every other Arab economy except for Saudi Arabia, and it's recognized by the vast majority of countries around the world far more than the Palestinians. But Israel should be basking in security, comfort, and success. Instead, it can't be comfortable because its future is inextricably linked with the freedom and prosperity of the Palestinians. And that's what I'm going to get into here. So let's talk about Gaza and the humanitarian crisis there. So Gaza, it's twice the size of Washington, D.C. The 3 of us are here in D.C. It has 2 million people that are now effectively penned in there because the number of people that can exit or enter Gaza is down by 98% from what it was a decade ago. Its population density is 13 times what it is in Israel. Its exports are down 80%. Its GDP per capita, let's listen to this fact. Its GDP per capita is 15 to 20 times lower what it is in Israel. Here in the US, when we talk about income inequality between the richest state and the poorest state, or different racial groups, we're talking about 1.5 times difference. This is 15 to 20 times a difference. So it's an extraordinary difference in income inequality. Unemployment is 53%. Youth unemployment is 70%. again, compared to Israel, where unemployment is 4%. The GDP in Gaza is a meager $3.5 billion, which is more than a year, which is more than 100 times lower than what it is in Israel. 97% of water is unfit for human consumption. Electricity is available, for the last few years, been available just 4 hours per day. They've got a bit more right now due to some foreign funding. And like many other densely populated areas around the world, Gaza could be prosperous. Indeed, once upon a time, it was as prosperous as the West Bank. Now living standards are half what it is in the West Bank. The bottom line is to make Gaza prosperous again, which is good for Palestinians, good for Israelis. It needs greater freedom of movement. It needs donor coordination for faster project implementation, and it needs better water and electricity. Let me just drill down here for 2 minutes here into a series of steps that could be implemented now that would be not only in the interest of people of Gaza, but also Israel's interest to implement now. And when Ilan, Natan, and I met as part of this project with, not only with Palestinians and Israelis, but even the Israeli military, we found that, and even senior members of Likud leadership, they were sort of, for the most part, all at least rhetorically supportive of a range of what would be characterized as humanitarian measures. Now, some of these measures we believe can be implemented now. Some of them may need to wait for a later stage, but the bulk of them can be implemented now, and I'll put them through in a handful of buckets. So first, freedom of movement. Again, imagine Gaza's 2 million people, only 300 people exit or enter Gaza every day, down from what was once upon a time 20,000 people that would enter or exit Gaza every day, mostly to work in Israel. Now none of them exit or enter to work in Israel. And so we believe that this task force essentially found that by increasing the possibility of Gazans to return to work in Israel, which, by the way, many leading folks in the Israeli military support, we can have really boost the economy. Every Gazan worker, because of large family sizes, supports 7 people at home. And this is not impossible. Today, tens of thousands of West Bankers work in Israel. And once upon a time, 20,000 Gazans worked in Israel. We can begin a process of returning a few thousand of them to work at a time, folks that can be clearly and easily vetted for security needs. So that's number one. Number two, again, Gaza is a densely populated urban area. It needs about 500 megawatts of electricity per day. For the last couple of years, it's had only about 160 megawatts. That's due to funding issues, but it's also due to this remarkable fact that the people of Gaza can't even, because of this 54% unemployment, can't even afford to buy electricity. And so we need not only donor support, but continued international funding for electricity to be supplied from Israel and Egypt. In the longer term, it needs solar power, and even in the medium term, a significant gas pipeline can and should be built to Gaza so that they can generate their own electricity for far less cost. Second, the third important category is water. And so, as I mentioned earlier, just imagine this: 97% of Gaza's water is unfit for human consumption. Also, 3/4 of human waste flows into the sea untreated. Most of that flows north to Israel and has led in many occasions to closing down of Israeli desalination facilities. Gaza needs significant investment in its waterworks and in its desalination. And so the bottom line is that this is sort of a cycle, a vicious negative cycle, whereby the people of Gaza don't have jobs, they can't afford to buy electricity and water. We need to flip that around. We need to create the jobs so that the people of Gaza can afford the water and electricity that they need to prosper. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll mention this, is on social services. 1.3 million people out of the 2 million in Gaza rely on the United Nations for education and healthcare. The United States was previously the largest funder of that education and healthcare until the Trump administration cut all of that funding late summer and early fall. This is, again, 260,000 students that get great secular education in Gaza. We pulled out our funding. Fortunately, the UN was able to scramble and pull that funding from Europe and from other Arab states. So, you know, in one hand, well, it's positive. It saves the American taxpayer money. On the other hand, it's completely written the United States out of the United Nations reform process, and so we no longer have a voice in that domain. So that's just a condensed 5-minute version. In our report, we have pages upon pages of details about all this, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about what is needed moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Hadi. This is Nathan Sachs. Why don't I jump in with a little bit about the politics? So this process that Ilan and Hadi described very well, you know, we went through a lot of conversations, and the first thing you'll often hear about Gaza is that the problem is obvious, and there are two different versions of this. Either simply Israel needs to lift the blockade and everything would be solved, or obviously who's at fault? Hamas is at fault. And I should say I have my own opinions, but what we try to do here is go beyond that. The question is not who's at fault. We have strong opinions on this, but why analytically do we have a problem that all our parties are not able to move past the situation that is so bad for obviously the Gazans, but also the Israelis and everyone else. And there are two sort of problems we identify. One is that we have a lot of different parties involved. Just on the ground, we have the Israelis, Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, and the Egyptians. Palestinian Authority and Hamas with very vicious rivalry between them, often the Palestinian Authority being the most hawkish anti-Hamas group, not Israel actually, and certainly not the Israeli military. And outside, we have a whole host of other parties who are interested in pushing in different directions. Arab states in the Gulf in different directions, the US, the EU, the UN, many others. The second big problem is that all these different groups have had generally two objectives in mind, and that includes the Americans. When we, the Americans, have tried to pursue things, it's usually either been to try and bring about some kind of reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah, to bring together the West Bank and the Gaza Strip so that the Palestinians can finally take control over their own destiny and try to move forward their own national project, or to bring about a ceasefire, a long-lasting ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, as Ilan described well, but one that would not just be this temporary thing that Ilan described, but something that could actually last. So when we looked at all this, we came up with basically two main recommendations. They're not easy. We don't think they're going to be implemented anytime soon, but we do think they offer the only serious way forward for the United States to pursue something that would ease the situation in Gaza and avoid the fact that we keep going back into these terrible crises that are bad for everyone. The first is to try and coordinate all these different parties together, not by America being the sole quarterback of everything, which is usually the recommendation you'll hear out of Washington. We're actually not saying that. We think the United States needs to coordinate, especially with two main parties, the United Nations, but a very particular part of it, UNSCO, which has very good relations with the Israelis and the Palestinians and others. And secondly, with the Egyptians, who have been a major player in this whole regard. Together, the Americans, the Egyptians, UNSCO, can do a lot that cannot be done separately. The second main point is that each one of these different elements cannot be done separately. You cannot pursue a ceasefire separately from trying to reintegrate the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So we recommend that only together it can be done. And why is that? Because a deal, if one were possible, would have to look something like this. Israel and Hamas would have to have a meaningful ceasefire, because Israel cannot simply lift the blockade if it's going to face Hamas that's rearming itself and is going to go back into conflict anytime soon. It has to have a meaningful ceasefire. And as Hadi said, we've spoken to very senior Israelis, including senior cabinet ministers, and there are many who are very open to a long-term, in fact, very long-term ceasefire, even with Hamas, given exactly what Hamas is, and we have exactly zero illusions about how bad Hamas is. But that cannot work in the long term, we think, without a second very important element. Ceasefire cannot hold if the Palestinian Authority is not heavily involved in policing, governing Gaza, because Hamas itself is not trustworthy, because the Israelis will not trust Hamas, and because a lot of the opening of the blockade and even the American dealing with it depends on an interlocutor that is not Hamas that we can deal with. The Palestinian Authority is the only one that can effectively offer some governance in the Gaza Strip and replace some of Hamas. And for that, we need a meaningful reintegration of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, something that is very popular among the Palestinian streets. It's one of the most popular things among Palestinians, but one that the Palestinian Authority in particular is very reluctant to do. So in short, what we get is a triangle, basically. It's not a deal between Israel and Hamas. It's not a deal between Israel and the PA. It's a triangle where Israel and Hamas agree on a ceasefire. Hamas and the PA agree on some meaningful reintegration, not beautiful reconciliation between the two hated parties, but rather some meaningful reintegration of the two parties. And Israel and the PA, Israel basically makes the PA whole in this whole deal. The PA is the one that has the hardest one here. And Israel offers something meaningful in the West Bank to the PA, things that Israel, including this government or previous Netanyahu governments, have discussed, such as transferring some authority in Area C, the area that Israel controls fully in the West Bank, to some partial Palestinian control. This kind of triangle, this kind of deal that would include all three elements, all three parties, would not be perfect. It would not mean that we cannot go back to conflict. It would not mean that Hamas disarms completely. It certainly does not mean Hamas transforms into some peace-loving organization. But it does mean that all the major parties can pursue their core vital interests, Hamas alleviating itself of the burden of ruling Gaza alone, Israel alleviating itself from this recurrent attacks by missiles from Gaza Strip, and the Palestinian Authority both gaining national reconciliation or national reintegration, but also gaining something from Israel meaningful in terms of the future of a two-state solution and governance in the West Bank. And for the United States, we think, I'll just conclude by this is a task force about US policy. We think this is the kind of policy the US might pursue. We don't think it's going to happen today. We don't think the US or the Israelis or the Palestinians are there at the moment. But we think that if we start speaking seriously about a proposal that doesn't demonize Israel or just think that one side or the other is a blame for everything, but one that seriously put forward a policy that the United States and other parties can pursue, put it together now, and if we try to disseminate it now, we hope that a future administration may be able to pursue something like this or some kind of version of it. Why don't I pause there and maybe turn it back to you, Susie?
Thank you, Natan. Thank you, Hadi. Thank you, Ilan. Now, folks on the webinar, this is your chance to ask a question. So again, if you want to just type in a question and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And while you're doing that, I will kick off with the first question. So Natan, despite what you said at the beginning of your remarks or during your remarks, aren't you really saying that Israel is at fault and this is just giving into Hamas? I think we need to understand better how this is not just giving into Hamas and how it's not just placing the blame on Israel.
Sure, and my colleagues might have more to add. I'll say very briefly the following. Hamas is absolutely terrible. I have zero illusions about Hamas. I don't think it's a partner for peace in the long term. But there's one thing about Hamas that is even more terrible, is that it's here to stay. It's not disappearing. It unfortunately has some significant support among Palestinians, and it does control the Gaza Strip at the moment, and therefore needs to be dealt with. And that's why when you speak to Israeli military planners and others, they try to figure out how Israel should move forward. And some people, especially on the right, actually in Israel, on the hawkish side, say we should have some kind of ceasefire with the devil, but the devil we know, and a ceasefire where we don't suffer these rockets all the time. To do that, one has to find a situation where the Gaza Strip is livable. What Hadi described is both a humanitarian catastrophe, which you should care about. It's also bad for Israel because, as he said, for example, the water flows into Israel. But it also means that the situation with Hamas is simply not stable. You're not going to have a serious ceasefire, a stable ceasefire with any party, as bad as it might be, if it's under this kind of blockade. And so does Hamas gain anything from the deal we propose? Unfortunately, yes. I'll be perfectly honest. It of course would prefer a deal. That's why the deal might hold, because Hamas would gain something. But Israel would gain enormously as well, something that I care about. The Palestinian Authority and the right configuration could also gain a lot, and all parties might move forward. Again, I'll just say one more time, maybe the third time already. This is not a rosy scenario. We're not describing some kind of idyllic situation or peace, by the way. This is not a peace deal. We're describing a situation that might make a very bad situation that's been stuck for over a decade, that has the humanitarian aspects that Hadi described and the political aspects for everyone involved, including Israel, might make that somewhat better. And that, we think, given the severity of the situation, is well worth trying. Ilan, Hadi, I don't know if you guys have something to add to that point.
No, I think you said it well, Natan.
All right, so I'm going to go to our first question from the participants, which is, how does Iran fit into your recommendations?
Sure. I'm happy to take that. I mean, look, Iran is an important player in that it remains a supporter of Hamas. I think it's important to distinguish between Iran's role with Hezbollah, where it has a direct line of communication to Hezbollah. It can fly planes, from Tehran full of weapons into Damascus and then ship those weapons into the Bekaa Valley and into southern Lebanon. And has had a long relationship. I mean, it was key to standing up Hezbollah in the first place. Iran, in the context of Hamas, is a problem actor, but the relationship is not as deep. And even more important, we have between those borders being controlled by Egypt, which has no interest in Iran getting weapons into Gaza, and Israel controlling the other border, the ability of Hamas to bring weapons into Gaza is not nearly the same as it is to bring weapons into southern Lebanon. So Iran's influence is much more limited. But what we do recommend when we talk about this unified effort that includes, at the core level, Egypt, the US, and the UN, and then on the outer level, all the other key actors, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, the European Union. All this is meant to build an international consensus on how to solve this problem, which would isolate Iran, because that consensus absolutely revolves around not continuing to arm and fund Hamas, and certainly not providing weapons to Hamas. So I think that if you're able to pursue this approach, you further isolate Iran internationally while cutting off their ability to arm or support Hamas, I should say, in any kind of meaningful way. And that's how we try to approach this. Anything else from Hadi or Natan, or is that?
Okay, so here's the next question. Unruh school textbooks are full of incitement against Jews and Israelis. Why should the US or anyone pay for that? Why not treat the Palestinian Arabs like any other refugees in the world and absorb them into the countries where many of them are now living?
Okay, so let's deconstruct the Unruh situation. So first of all, once upon a time, about 20 years ago, there was incitement in Palestinian textbooks. It turns out now, the Bush administration did a study at the end of the Bush administration. We funded a study, it was a US government funded study during the Obama administration. It turns out now there really is, very, very limited amounts of things in the textbook. So that just is really no longer the case. It was a problem. It was addressed. It's not really the case moving forward. So that's number one on textbooks. Number two, and there are all kinds of studies that can be referenced on that. Number two, let's look at the alternatives in the Gaza Strip in particular. Do you prefer that the United Nations undertakes education there to 250,000 students, or do you prefer that Hamas undertakes education there to the 250,000 students? Those are sort of the two alternatives there. And then thirdly, on who can or should pay, again, I would argue, I think this task force would have argued that the United States should continue its leading funding role. If you're concerned about textbooks issues, which I believe have largely been addressed, but if you have a concern about it, by paying, you have a seat at the table. And I know that while the U.S. government was funding that, Unruh was always very responsive to even the slightest concern about, one teacher posted one insightful thing on Facebook. We would track that and communicate that back to Unruh, and there would be disciplinary action. We no longer have a vote at the table. So if you are concerned about that behavior, the best way to do it is to participate in the process. The U.S. is now outside of that process.
Can I add one thing just on Unruh, which is just to say that there's this sort of idea out there that because of Unruh, we have all the Palestinian refugees. And the reality is the Palestinian refugees, gain their status from UN Security Council resolutions, UN human rights, and international law, which says that it goes from generation to generation. This is absolutely not unusual compared to other conflicts in terms of until you find places to resettle these people, they remain refugees, potentially for generations. And this is not the only conflict where that is the case. It's gotten huge in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because of how long it's gone. But UNRWA is not the one that drives that. UNRWA drives the services. So if you get rid of UNRWA, you get rid of all the services for all these people without actually dealing with the political problem in terms of how you address the refugees. So it's the worst of all worlds. It's deeply destabilizing. And when the U.S. did choose to defund UNRWA, you had very strong opposition inside Israeli security circles who were all worried about what was going to happen. Fortunately, other actors in the international community have stepped up and basically filled the hole. But the bottom line is, as Hadi said, we now have a lot less leverage over what UNRWA does because we're no longer a donor to UNRWA.
If I may, Susie, just add one more thing. There's an unpleasant reality, like many things in this conflict, which is we're choosing between bad and worse. In the Gaza Strip, if Gazan kids don't go to UNRWA schools, the alternative is very clear. It's either the street or it's a Hamas-controlled school. And a Hamas-controlled school, you can bet, would be full of incitement and anti-Semitism and far worse than what we used to see in UNRWA. And secondly, it would be deeply religious Islamist education. I mean, in UNRWA schools, you have girls and boys going to essentially secular schools. That's much, much better than these millions, hundreds of thousands of kids in a population of 2 million going to Hamas-controlled schools. Again, we could wish them away. We could hope this problem didn't exist, but it's 2 million people right at the doorstep of Israel. And that generation that's growing up there, that is going to these UNRWA schools at the moment, that might go to Hamas schools, they're going to be there in the next generation. And in about 20 years, we're expecting Gaza Strip to be double the population. So it's something that has to be dealt with realistically, not in terms of what we hope UNRWA or anyone else would be, but what the actual alternatives are. And in the Gaza Strip, I think the alternative is very clear. It's Hamas, which is far worse.
Thank you. Next question. What are the realistic odds of this tri-party agreement actually coming to pass?
Elon, you want to go for that?
Sure, I'll try that first. I think right now, incredibly low. Acknowledge that. I don't think a right-wing government, certainly not a sort of far right-wing government, is open to it in Israel, given the current construction of the coalition. President Abbas is totally not open to a deal like this. And in the United States, I don't think that this is something that this administration is all that open to either. However, we specifically argue in the report that you need to wait for a moment of opportunity. You can start to socialize it with everybody now. You can build international support for it. You can run the ideas through people, but you need to wait for a moment of opportunity. And we see 3 possible moments of opportunity. One, Abbas's total anti-Gaza policy is not widely shared across the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian spectrum. And if he were to depart the stage, which will happen at some point, there might be an opportunity. Second, we have Israeli elections coming up. Who knows how that goes in April, but even into the future, at some point you might have a different Israeli leadership or government that's more open to it. And third, maybe sadly most important, is where this is most likely to, parties are most likely to actually come to an agreement is if you saw another major conflict and they were really looking down the barrel of either Israel feeling like it needs to reoccupy the entire Gaza Strip or Hamas looking at it where it's completely destroyed and ejected from Gaza. These are very ugly scenarios in a potential next conflict. And in those moments, the parties might become more flexible and be willing to go for a tripartite deal like this. So we don't think it can work now, but we looked at all kinds of different options. And this is what we see as the most viable one. Right now, nobody even has a roadmap for how you even get out of this mess. So we thought one of the major contributions of the report is at least sort of putting down a roadmap for how you could get out of this mess in the future if the situation improves. In the meantime, you can't, so you do all the things Hadi talked about to just try to minimize and address the immediate situation on water, electricity, and freedom of movement while you wait and try to manage and see if you can get the better deal in the long term.
Anybody else want to add, or I'll go on to the next question. Why does the burden seem to be only on Israel and not on Egypt as well? Because they are also blockading Gaza.
Look, I think that's right. I think the burden in our report, I gave a really condensed presentation for this group. We do outline a number of steps that Egypt can take. We do outline a number of steps that a range of Arab countries, Saudis, Qataris, Emiratis can take. I was focused here on the steps that Israel could take. Look, the truth of the matter is that that the Gazan economy, until a decade ago, was inextricably linked with the Israeli economy and the West Bank economy. The Gaza's workers had professional opportunities in Israel, and so it's the natural fit. It's a natural fit in basic economics for Gaza. There just are not the economic opportunities on the Egyptian side. And I would also add, that Egypt and Israel largely work in concert and coordination on the relationship with Gaza, and so that's why I focus the comments here on Egypt. But if either of my colleagues want to add anything.
I'd just say that I think the question is a good one. Egypt is a major player, and as Ilan and I mentioned earlier, Egypt is an absolutely crucial player in this story, and it's crucial partly because of its responsibility. It borders the Gaza Strip, it's a party to the blockade, but also because it's one of the only parties that has real leverage with everyone. We in this report do not recommend, for example, that the United States open relations with Hamas. Right now, the United States government does not have full relations with Hamas or anything near that, and we don't recommend that change. Right now, this administration has very little relations with the Palestinian Authority too, which is a difficulty. The Israelis have much more contact with the Palestinian Authority on many things. But the Egyptians and UNSCO, but especially the Egyptians, have a unique position where they have very serious relations and even leverage with both the Palestinian Authority and even with Hamas, whom they hate for their own reasons, but have serious relations with. That's something that we need to leverage. It puts a lot of responsibility on the Egyptians, and that's very much part of what we propose. But it also means that we, the United States, together with the Egyptians and UNSCO, can move a lot of things forward that we alone cannot, that the Israelis alone cannot. The Egyptians, not to paint a rosy picture about it, but the Egyptians do have serious leverage now and some will to do some serious things. With the right kind of coordination and maybe cajoling by the Americans, together with our partners, the Israelis, we might be able to do a lot more.
Okay. Let's see. Sorry, pulling up the next question here. Bear with me, folks. Why can't we count on an eventual breaking point between Hamas and a critical mass of Gaza residents in which they rise up?
I can try, or Hattie or Natan, do you want?
Go ahead.
So, look, that's been the theory of the case for the last 12 years. And it hasn't happened. And I think it hasn't happened for two reasons. One is Hamas controls all the guns. And so even an uprising would fail, almost certainly, because there's no other way to bring weaponry in that is not controlled by Hamas. So it's not like you have all these people who are able to bring in alternative sources of weapons. They can't. The weapons that exist in Gaza are the ones that are mostly already there, and those are already controlled by Hamas. So that's one. The second is that, I think Hamas has done a decent job, a good job of putting the blame and fault on Israel. And politically, that's just how this works. You don't get usually in situations like this historically, you always are more effective putting it on the external party than on your own internal governance. And third is a moral question, which is, look, it's only a small percentage of the population that actually really supports Hamas. And it's even smaller percentage that supports sort of the military steps and is actually actively involved in terrorism and things like that. And the overwhelming majority of the population of these 2 million people are innocent and stuck in the middle of this conflict. And so there's a moral question of how much do you want to inflict pain on all these civilians and have them suffer the way they're suffering for something that hasn't worked for the last 12 years, as opposed to looking for alternatives. And even if you were to have, I'm not sure the Israeli government would actually be excited if these people were to rise up against Hamas. I think what you would then have is absolute chaos inside Gaza, and you'd have a situation more like Syria or Yemen. And then you'd have all kinds of other extremist groups gaining even more influence, like ISIS and other actors inside of Gaza. I think the Israeli security establishment much prefers to have they always talk about having an address inside of Gaza, having somebody they can talk to and signal. And as long as Hamas exists as it does, it gives them that. So I think you're really playing with fire if that's a scenario that you want to go with. It's risky for Israel's security, and from a humanitarian perspective, it's really catastrophic. So Hadi or Natan, I don't know if you guys want to throw anything else on top of that.
No, I think what was said.
Okay, next question. Putting Gaza in the mix does make for a three-state solution. The reality appears that Gaza is on a separate plane. So why would separate negotiations between Israel and the PA and then Gaza not be a viable option?
Well, I'm happy to try briefly, although I'm sure others have more to add. A three-state solution would be a disaster, I think. And part of what this tries to address is allowing for a situation where Gaza can come away from the abyss without ensuring a three-state solution. So some people basically advocate for a three-state solution. Well, they say Israel and Hamas would have a long-term ceasefire between them and keep Hamas in control of Gaza as a separate entity, separate from the West Bank. The problem is twofold. First, this kind of ceasefire can't hold because Hamas is not actually after governing the Gaza Strip. That's certainly not what it's after. And Hamas is not a reliable actor in that kind of scenario. And so what you get is, again, the kind of ceasefires that we've seen in the past that break down very quickly. And again, a terrible cycle of violence with many thousands of rockets entering Israel and devastation in Gaza. The second point is that a three-state solution is not a serious solution for the future, because the Palestinian Authority, even as such, would have a hard time being a viable state. If you can imagine a state in sort of a rump state in part of the West Bank, and then the Gaza Strip isolated from everything, this is not a stable scenario. It's not an equilibrium. The only way forward is something that looks like a two-state solution, or is a two-state solution, but that allows the Gaza Strip to go back to its natural economic backyard, as Hadi described it, which is first and foremost the West Bank economy, but also the Israeli economy, of course, and something that is integrated in an orderly and agreed upon fashion. This existed before. I mean, this idea that the Gaza Strip is sort of this Netherland that we can't think of is new. It's only a decade old. I grew up in Israel. As a kid, I remember seeing Gazans in Israel all the time. You saw them more than West Bankers often because Gaza is so close to the coast in Israel. And that can be in the future, and Gaza, in fact, has a lot of opportunity to offer. Without it, if you sever forever the West Bank from the Gaza Strip, you're dooming, of course, the Gaza Strip, but you're also dooming the West Bank to what would be an economically unviable reality, which would be very bad for Israel as well, because it would mean that that kind of solution, a three-state solution, would be extremely unstable and therefore not a solution at all.
Hadi, do you want to add anything on the Palestinian?
Can you repeat the question? I just want to make sure I'm understanding it exactly correctly.
The question was about putting Gaza in the mix makes for a three-state solution. And the reality appears that Gaza is on a separate plane. So why would separate negotiations between Israel and the PA and then Gaza not be a viable option?
Israel and the PA and then Gaza. So I'll flip it back and talk more about politics here for a second. So we're not putting Gaza first. We're not putting Gaza last. What we're doing is we're kind of, again, think of it as a triangle where you've got three separate things that come together, and that you've got, again, a relationship. You're building up a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza. You're developing a relationship, but you're building the relationship between the PA and Gaza, and you're building up a relationship between Israel and the PA. And so this whole notion, it's actually, as Natan said, it's a way to help fuse together the Palestinians, bring them together around a common vision. You know, West Bank Gaza reconciliation is very popular with the populations of the West Bank and Gaza. It's the political leaderships that haven't been able to do it. So by putting Gaza as a main issue on the table, as opposed to leaving it for last, could be a way to actually push the Palestinians back together. And then by doing that, actually make peace more possible, not less possible. So, you know, we think this doesn't exactly, anyway, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to just add one thing, which is the Palestinians overwhelmingly oppose the notion of a three-state solution, and so does the entire Arab world. And we found in our research that if you ever brought up this idea, it automatically shut down any ability to do anything with anyone in the Arab world or with the Palestinians. They hear the word three-state solution and they say, we're not working with you, period, end, stop, done. So anybody who comes and says, I want to help Gaza and we're going to do it as part of promoting a three-state solution, you'll make zero progress with the Palestinian side or with the Arab world. So you have to go for this reintegration as part of a policy to make any progress on anything, including basic humanitarian questions.
Okay, next question. If your plan is long-term, what are some short-term actions that should be taken?
Well, the short-term actions, again, are a large number of the economic actions that we have in our report. So on freedom of movement, that means going from, again, there are, 100,000 West Bankers that work in Israel. There used to be 20,000 Gazans that work in Israel. Can we, after the Israeli elections, return to a place where 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 Gazans become regular workers in Israel? That will start to create an income flow. And by the way, we found when talking to communities, Israeli farming communities around Gaza, they want Gazans to return to work in their fields because it creates an incentive. When they go back home, they're like, hey, it's not so bad over there, or making money over there. Please don't, send rockets or burning kites over there. So number one is that freedom of movement issue. Number two is, again, boosting the electricity supply. Number three is boosting the water supply. And so there are various ways that those could be done that we have outlined in our report. They're practical. They're not pie in the sky. There are practical ways that electricity can be boosted in Gaza. Electricity lines can be built. Both Egypt and Israel can supply more electricity over a couple of year term. Solar power plants can be built over a 5-year term. A 4-year term from now, a gas line can be put into Gaza to fuel the Gaza power plant once again to provide electricity at lower cost. So there are a range of things along these lines that can help. In addition, going back to freedom of movement, the industrial zones can be developed on Gaza's borders. Restrictions can be lifted on Gazans' ability to export goods into Israel and the West Bank. So there are a range of economic issues that can begin right now. I don't know if either of my colleagues want to get into any of the political questions.
Well, just one other thing on economics is a very basic thing is to restart all the aid that the United States has cut off over the last few months, which we also recommend in the report. And on the political, I would just tell you, this is a long-term plan, but you have to build support for it over a long period of time. So you got to start by getting Egypt, the UN, and the US on exactly the same page. You can build political support in the Arab world. You can start socializing it with the Israelis. Egypt can socialize it with Hamas. We can socialize it with PA. They might not accept it now, but you got to build out a vision. So when the moment comes, we're not starting from scratch. You sort of say, like, here's the plan we all think is the most viable long-term option. Will everybody accept it now that there's a moment of opportunity? So I see those as the two things to do.
And I'd just like to ask a quick follow-up to that question, which is some of these steps that you recommend, I take it, are confidence-building measures to start to reestablish a sense of trust between the parties, which is obviously essential for any successful negotiation. Are there some steps that if Israel wanted to, it could implement tomorrow or next week?
I think so, absolutely. I think, and I think some of them are worthwhile whether they do confidence or not. So I think you're absolutely right that some of them are essential for the process of negotiation, but some of them, including the things that Hadi described, are essential simply to alleviate the conditions in the Gaza Strip. And many of them can be done even tomorrow, even not quite unilaterally, but without an agreement with all the different parties. So part of what we speak about, for example, we've seen this intransigence from the Palestinian Authority, an unwillingness to do a lot of things with the Gaza Strip, because at least the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, although most of the people there don't agree, want to sort of strangle the Gaza Strip even more in the hopes that somehow Hamas will disappear. But a lot of these steps can be done even without the Palestinian Authority, and that might even apply some pressure on the Palestinian Authority to move. So some of the things that Hadi described are like that. And secondly, I just add one more point, which is, since what we're talking about is an integrated approach, since we don't think you can actually effectively separate the Gaza Strip from the issues of the West Bank, some of the steps that Israel can do on the West Bank towards the Palestinian Authority can be done today. And those include things that are beyond the scope even of this report, but some things that we do mention, including on Area C and including on improving the conditions in the West Bank that would allow for resumption in the future, maybe, of negotiations over a two-state solution, but would also allow for this kind of plan, a much more modest plan, to have a chance of success. A lot of this does not depend on some idyllic agreement between all the parties. It can be done with a very hard-headed sort of cold look at reality.
Okay, next question, and I am watching the time, so I think we have time for one or, well, two maybe more questions. What should we expect when President Abbas passes, and what do you expect the transition process will be? Who are the best options for replacing Abbas in order to make your scenario more plausible?
That's an easy one.
All right, do you want to try it, or do you want me to try it, or Natan?
Whoever wants to take it.
All yours.
You're smiling so much, I just want to hear what you got to say.
Oh no, I'm smiling because this is your problem. I'll just say very shortly that first, in Judaism we say that since the temple was destroyed, prophecy is for fools, and this is exactly the kind of case where it's prophecy. We've heard, I'm not an expert in Palestinian politics, but I will say secondhand from people who are, including Hadi, there are a variety of different scenarios. There could be chaos. There could also be a separation of some of the powers. Abbas really has three roles. He's head of the PLO, he's head of the Palestinian Authority, he's also head of his own party, Fatah. In theory, those could be three different roles. I don't honestly know who the next person will be, and I think we should take with a big grain of salt predictions about who exactly it would be or what it would mean. And we should also be rather wary of trying to engineer that. The more we try to engineer it, the less likely whatever we engineer has legitimacy and is successful. What I think we should put in place and think about is, first, this is going to happen at some point. President Abbas will not be president forever. And when that moment comes, we might be in this sense of crisis that Elon described before, where you have crisis and you try to get out of the crisis immediately. If you have an idea of where you want to go, and this is one proposal on Gaza that we think has a chance, then when that moment of crisis comes, you can propose to whoever it is, this is where the United States stands. We've already spoken to the Egyptians in the UN. We've spoken to our European friends. We've spoken to the Gulf countries, all the different Gulf countries. This is where everyone thinks things should go. Will you come on board? There's a much better chance of success, whoever that person is. And with that, I'll punt it back to Hadi and others.
Yeah, I would just only add one small thing, which is, the scenario Natan talks about where you have chaos is one where you can't talk to anybody about the future of Gaza. So that's not a good scenario for us. The one where you have a new leadership looking to do something very popular for its own people early on to consolidate its popularity, like a reconciliation, a successful reconciliation effort would be, hugely supportive, 80 to 90% type support inside Palestinian public. So there's a real opportunity, but we have no idea how that's going to play out.
Ilan and Natan said it exactly right. I think we should not meddle. We should not have a strongman view of history. It isn't. We're going to be unable to engineer, and it's unclear. Look, Abbas is, a dozen years into a 4-year term. He's already effectively. He was elected, but he's overstayed his term. There are lots of scenarios. I was seeing some very senior Palestinians yesterday and kind of toying with some of them. One scenario is that the Palestinian prime minister, who by the way, I think just resigned today, although it's not clear if Abbas will accept his resignation, constitutionally, if the Palestinian prime minister is still there and is still the head of government at the time of resignation, or if Abbas were to pass away or to resign, so that he would be the head of government, at least in some senses, in the interim, if there was no one else appointed. But the bottom line is what the Palestinians need most is a democratic refresh, an opportunity to hold elections. And my hope is that there might be the possibility of elections in the West Bank and Gaza. And one challenge in that process is going to be elections, whether elections can be held in Area C of the West Bank that's controlled by Israel, whether elections can be held in East Jerusalem, as they were in the past, right? So I got to serve as an election observer at the prior Palestinian national elections, including right there in East Jerusalem, where I watched Palestinians casting votes. I think there's some ways around that, but I think that's also going to be a pathway forward.
And also whether, the role Hamas plays in any elections and whether they are willing to participate, respect outcomes, and be part of it, obviously.
So this is the last question, but I'll ask you to be brief so that we can honor the 3 o'clock closing time, 3 o'clock East Coast time. Does Israel recognize the severity of these humanitarian issues in terms of its own interest? And is there an opportunity for Israeli investment in Gaza to provide employment?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd say yes. And in fact, one of the things we found in our conversations is that many in the Israeli, certainly the security establishment, but also the political parties left and right, there's a recognition of just how bad things are. There is, of course, a lot of sense that it's not Israel's fault, that it's Hamas's fault, but there is a recognition that the situation is very bad for Israel. That doesn't mean that the way out is easy or that Israel doesn't have other interests. And in particular, the threat of any attack always means that Israel tries to hunker down and prevent any change. So there's a fear, of course, of any change. But secondly, what we describe in the report is not that we have a scenario where one party is simply unwilling to do what's right. Is that you have a rather complex scenario with a lot of different parties with different interests. And so what we're trying to put forward is a situation that we think would also allow Israel to advance its interests that Israel absolutely recognizes and does try to advance. I'll give one example and just close on that. Hadi mentioned that there's some cash going into Israel. It's rather, I feel like I'm living in the Twilight Zone. That cash is Qatari money coming with Israeli support into the Gaza Strip to Hamas. So it's really a reality that you would never imagine Israel supporting in the past. Why is Netanyahu approving this personally as Prime Minister and Minister of Defense? The reason he's doing it is because the situation in Gaza is so bad, and he too recognizes the need for change. But without an active American role that is smart, that has a realistic idea of what can be done, none of the parties, even Israel, can change the situation from the bottom up. And we hope that this report can make a contribution to what might be an American policy going forward that could help Israel, but also others, the Palestinians and others, in advancing a situation that's better.
So I'm going to end on that excellent remark, Natan. And first of all, I want to thank Hadi, Ilan, Natan, and everybody who participated on this call. You should know that today's webinar is basically a precursor to a national tour that Israel Policy Forum will be organizing, featuring this report and the 3 stellar folks you just heard from today. Their new report, which is titled Ending Gaza's Perpetual Crisis, a new U.S. approach on Gaza, specifically tackles the dilemma and the dilemmas and the cycle of violence that currently characterize the situation in Gaza, as you heard about today. The tour will include Jewish communities in Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, among others. And if anybody on the call is from a different community than the ones I mentioned and is interested in our bringing this program to your community, please let either JCPA or Israel Policy Forum know, and we will work with you to try to partner with you in bringing this important information to your community. Finally, if you don't already have access to Israel Policy Forum's online resources, please go to our website, israelpolicyforum.org, where you will find a host of useful information on a number of topics related to the Middle East, including this report. You can go to our website and you will see a link to read this report, which I commend to you. It's really worth reading. And since it is at the end of our hour together, I want to thank everybody at JCPA, and of course, again, thank Hadi, Ilan, and Natan for a very useful and informative hour, and thank all of you for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.
Susie.
Thank you.
Thank you, APF.
Bye.